Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're asking, is it a descent towards civil war that we're now witnessing in Ukraine? Our correspondent saying to us earlier that there's no fewer than 12 flashpoints in the east and south of Ukraine right now, where pro-Kiev forces are facing resistance from separatists. We're talking about it with FEMEN activist SHEVCHENKO. Also from Moscow, Dmitry BABICH, columnist and journalist with The Voice of Russia, and NIVAT, a French reporter who has been there, and Anton KOSLOV, teaches at the American Graduate School of Paris, and Camille, director of the Foundation for Strategic Research. Welcome back to all of you. Now, we're talking in part one of our discussion about the situation in Odessa last Friday, which turned violent and where it resulted in a blaze. More than 40 killed. Our correspondent Gulliver Cragg telling us that it's been a day of mourning there, with funerals beginning this Monday. We also saw scenes in Moscow with flowers put outside the Ukrainian embassy there, and a spokesperson for the Russian president, Dmitry Peskov, saying it is obvious that under the current constitution, in the conditions of combat actions, a punitive operation, and as he put it, mass killing, it is at least absurd to speak about elections on May the 25th. Camille,
this is quite a paradox. Russia is supporting elections in Syria, where 140,000 people have been killed in the last 4 years, and says that elections can't take place because there is violence in Ukraine. I think, of course, the events in Ukraine make the election more difficult, make the election more difficult to organize, more difficult to monitor. The fact that OSCE observers were taken hostage is also that sort of message sent to the international community. But on the other hand, the situation in Ukraine can only be resolved through this process of having a legitimate government in Kiev, elected government that can negotiate. So you can't at the same time deny the legitimacy of the current government and say that the elections can't take place, because this is keeping Kiev in a political vacuum that makes it impossible to negotiate any way out of the current crisis. So I think it's a crucial element.
And NIVAT?
I think Moscow is really playing hot and cold in this story, it's sometimes, you know, it's like a war of words. I mean, Moscow knows exactly what to say to the West in order to please the West. It went to Geneva, they signed an agreement, and didn't care about what was really in the agreement. Moscow decided probably to free the 7 OSCE hostages, and you know, with the words, Lavrov recently, I think today, said again something in favor, that shows that he is in favor of the resolution of the conflict. But on the field, when you're on the field, it's completely different. And that is what is important. And I would like to stress one thing. In Russia, what Putin is now doing in Ukraine, I mean, what he's showing to his own country, to Russia, is very popular, what he's doing. I mean, even who are the voices within the Russian opposition to Putin, saying, who could say that they are against what's happening in Ukraine, who could say that they are against what the Kremlin, what Russia is doing in Ukraine? Almost nobody is talking. So Putin has gained, and it reminds me what he did in Chechnya, during the war in Chechnya. This sort of high degree of nationalism excites everybody in Russia. And that is something that is barely noticed here in the West.
Dmitry BABICH, do you say yes to elections in Syria and no to elections in Ukraine?
No, I don't think this is the case, and there is a very important difference. In Syria, there was an internal insurgency, unfortunately infiltrated by the worst people on the face of the earth, the Islamist fundamentalists, and unfortunately also, in a paradoxical way, held by the West. But there had been no coup d'etat before. In Ukraine, you had the president who was legitimately elected in 2010, and the West recognized that election. And he was removed in a very, very dubious fashion. Let me remind you that just recently, when the Ukrainian Rada, the parliament, under Yanukovych in January, adopted some laws against protests in Ukraine, the West was up in arms against it, saying that the use of the army against protesters in Kiev would mean crossing a very important red line for Yanukovych.
But it was the parliament that voted for the transition, including members of his own party.
Yes, after the Maidan activists entered the building of that parliament, after they insulted
after security forces shot dead a lot of people in the street.
And after there were several months of throwing Molotov cocktails at police, and this shooting was a very, very murky affair. As you know, there was shooting from both sides. So when this same Rada, there was no new election, just several weeks ago, adopted a much more draconian law, this time against the protesters in the east of Ukraine, the West did not find a single word of critique for that. When this new Ukrainian government, only elected by this old Rada, sent the army against the people in eastern Ukraine, against the protesters, the West again did not find a single critical word, although just recently the West said that Yanukovych would be dead politically if he used the army against protesters. So everyone sees this double standard of the West, and elections in modern Ukraine cannot be legitimate because you have at least 600 people killed in the recent months. For what? For nothing. Just because of that strange association agreement with the EU that Yanukovych postponed signing. So in this situation,
but yes to elections in Syria and no to elections in Ukraine is what you're saying.
No, I think that in Syria it's also a joke to speak about elections right now when the country is in turmoil and there is an obvious outside interference from many countries. The Western press is also writing about it, not only from Iran, but also from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from the Western countries. So to blame everything on Russia is very easy, but Aneva knows exactly that there are dozens of newspapers and internet sites and even 2 TV channels in Russia which oppose Putin's policy in Crimea. I can name you all of these newspapers like Независимая газета, like Коммерсант, like Ведомости, they are all against. So to say that it's impossible to object to Putin's policy in Russia is not true. It's simply a lie.
It's not what we're saying.
This is what you are saying.
I'm just wondering why you are defending Yanukovych. Even Putin thinks that Yanukovych is a dead politician.
I'm not defending Yanukovych. I'm defending legitimacy. Under Yanukovych, bad as he was legitimately elected.
That's right. He was legitimately elected, and now he left his country.
He left his country because he was overthrown and because he was fearing for his life. We saw how it happened.
Dmitry, he ran away. There was a revolution. This is maybe something very difficult for you to understand, but there was a revolution. There were people, half of the country were coming out at the square to say they don't want this regime anymore. And that president was not taken out of his house by someone. He ran away, shamefully packing his gold from his house and running away shamefully to Putin and to hide himself in Russia. And even there, he was not welcomed by Putin.
Aneva knows precisely what kind of revolution we lived through in 1917. It was the same kind of attitude from the Bolsheviks. Everything that serves the revolution is moral and democratic. And this is a Bolshevist
Dmitry, I'm
attitude.
extremely happy you're participating in these debates because I was very disturbed by Russian propaganda and I was thinking, how should I show it to world public? And now you are doing it perfectly. I don't even have to say anything anymore. Thank you very much, Dmitry.
I'm telling the truth, and I know that the revolution in 1917 was a disaster for Russia and for Ukraine. The fact that the same methods are used now, because the new rulers of Ukraine saying that everything that serves the revolution is moral and democratic, everything that doesn't serve the revolution is undemocratic and immoral. This is a Bolshevist attitude. The fact that 2 candidates for presidency from the east of Ukraine, Oleg Tsarev and Mikhail Dobkin, were badly beaten just 2 weeks ago. And it was done in public, unfortunately, with Tsarev.
Dmitry,
what kind of elections can you have when candidates are being beaten?
One of Ukrainian deputies from Tymoshenko party was recently killed. They cut parts of his body and threw him in the river.
I think
few days ago, there are Ukrainian officers.
When people are being beaten and when they have their fingers cut.
This is not an argument, Dmitry. There are people killed from both sides, and this is not an argument.
All right, let me just a couple of other Dmitry, a couple of reactions. First of all, one on Facebook from Ahmed saying a new door of hell will be opened just like in Syria. So there's a lot of people, Anton KOSLOV, who are very worried.
I think, first of all, to use the word revolution is, for me, is misleading, because what is revolution? I mean, it's, if we're talking about the classic examples of revolutions, it's either setting up a new state or transforming property relations, turning completely the system of law, and so on and so forth. Right now, what we're seeing in Kiev is basically the change of government, the return to the constitution that was there before. We do not see any fundamental changes in terms of the setup of property relations, social relations. I mean, we know what the French Revolution was about back
there is a popular discomfort.
Well, but
I mean,
let me finish. What I'm saying is we have to really be precise about the terms we use to begin with. Now, if this is a revolution, then, of course, I mean, we have the change of everything, and then by this logic, Russia doesn't have to respect any agreement signed with the previous government because it's no longer there. Now, on the other hand, if we do have some kind of legitimate continuity of government, we have to respect the principle of due process, legal due process. And unfortunately, when it comes to Yanukovych's departure, this due process was not respected. I mean, I hate to say I'm not at all backing Putin. I'm not Russian. I'm not at all working for the GRU or the KGB. Let's make it clear. But what I'm saying is that we do have these legal terms that we have to respect, and they were not respected. And we got to talk about it. And we do have certain journalists talking about it in England, in France, in the United States. But we do not.
So how do we get from point A to point B then?
Well, as I said, unfortunately, today we have a situation when the State Department, British Foreign Ministry, French President, and so on and so forth, they accepted the course of events, which is, okay, they did. I think they have to negotiate, because the problem with the eastern part of Ukraine is that they do not recognize the legitimacy of the government in Kiev. And they have to negotiate, because the government of Kiev cannot claim, without what I just described, I think, they cannot legally justify their action.
Camille.
I think the key issue at the moment, if we want to avoid to see a situation like in the former Yugoslavia, because what frightens me at the moment is the sort of rhetoric that is being used. The Maidan people in Kiev are not Nazis or anything of the sort. It's a popular uprising against a regime that was corrupted, and it ended up in a fairly messy situation, and we hope it will get back on its feet through an electoral process. That would be the optimistic scenario. But if we continue to fuel a form of very, very specific propaganda, and I have to say that a lot of it is coming from the Russian side at the moment, of using images, symbols that are associated with World War II, when this is not the situation we're talking about. We're talking about a very messy situation in Ukraine.
And there's a lot of people worried in the build-up to May the 9th, which is an important date. It's the
Indeed, and I'm not sure that this is absolutely the right thing to do at this time, if we are all talking about de-escalation, for Mr. Putin to go to Crimea to celebrate the end of World War II. I'm not sure this is, and that was a euphemism. But on the other hand, on May 11th, we also have the vote in the Donbass on autonomy. So we see all these moves taking place. We know that there are different views amongst Ukrainians on what sort of degree of federalization is acceptable, what sort of relationship is preferable between Russia and the European Union. Those tendencies do exist and have always existed in the last 20 years in Ukraine. But the Ukrainian society did manage to live together, to build a project together. There were various moments of crisis, but this is not a divided country in a civil war unless people fuel it. And then we end up in a situation which is a bit the Yugoslavian situation, where people that were living together fairly peacefully for 40 years suddenly started killing each other. And that's my fear.
But I think KOSLOV is right when saying that they should be negotiating. But do you think there is room for negotiations now?
Exactly. This is
That's
the
problem.
Question.
Is there room for negotiating?
I think they can definitely negotiate.
They
should.
They can negotiate only with guns. I think that 6 months.
For the moment.
6 months proved already that.
No, I disagree with that, because you're talking 6 months. I mean, the existing situation has been around for about.
This is a revolution. I'm really wondering why it's so hard to understand that people are not agreeing
I understand
with
that
the
people are
regime
fed up with corruption. I understand all of that. But for
so
me,
why don't you recognize it as a revolution?
Because it's not enough to be a revolution. I think there's much more required for this to be a revolution.
Why many nations are not moving.
Can there be negotiations at this point?
Well, as I said today, we all wish we could negotiate and without guns and without blood and without death every second.
Here, you are not there, and who should negotiate it? The people who are there, and it's not.
Sure, of course.
It's not easy to negotiate in such an atmosphere right now.
I think that negotiation is possible when both sides are ready.
Yeah.
To talk about Ukraine,
they are not ready.
To talk about Ukrainian side. Well, they are weak, and we all recognize it. And they would happily be able to negotiate with another side, but another side is ready to negotiate only with the guns.
I think that the trouble at the moment is the following. There were fairly mild reaction, at least I believe, to the takeover of Crimea.
Almost none.
Almost none. And there was a sense, rightly or wrongly, I believe it was wrongly, but in the West, that it should, this was more or less Russian, and that could be understood. So even though it was not formally recognized, there were the reactions and the sanctions that came afterwards were fairly mild. The issue at stake at the moment is that what is happening in these days in eastern Ukraine is a sort of, it could be a repetition of the same sort of move, and this is where we are moving into something very different. Because what we see is a potential split of the country with some regions controlled by those separatist groups, even though if they are not necessarily leaning towards joining Russia. I mean, if you look at the vote, it's much more splitted than expected.
Okay, one reaction on Twitter from Alex. Only Putin can prevent a civil war in Ukraine. If he stopped, a civil war could be avoided. And I want to put the question a little bit differently to you, Ina. Can there be a Ukrainian solution to this, or with Russia looming so large, the West has to do more and step up to the plate?
Well, I do believe that Ukraine lonely, they cannot do that. And right now they are showing it. They are showing, and in fact, they are showing it and asking for help because they are weak. They cannot do it. They cannot do that. You see, we have very weak army. And there are people right now joining army because there are no soldiers on Ukrainian side to be able even to stand at the borders and not even to fight. So Ukraine will not be able by themselves to prevent the further developing of conflict. And I do agree, in fact, with a tweet that you just read, that everything is unfortunately in hands of Putin.
Everything's in Putin's hands.
Do you think he's the only one to avoid the civil war?
Well, you know, I think that right now with the weak reaction of West, we can say that right now everything in the hands of Putin. Because if there would be a stronger reaction from West, I do believe he would.
And what would be a stronger reaction from the West? In your view?
I think that we are foolish to think that with the sanctions like visa sanctions, we can stop such a person like Putin. I think that if we're talking about sanctions, there has to be real sanctions and not only beautiful speeches and not only sanctions, vocal sanctions.
Camille, on Friday, the U.S. president in the company of the German chancellor talked about what he called sectorial sanctions, things such as defense, energy. Do you see that happening?
What is clear is that the Western countries, even if they are divided because they have divided interest, tend to think that there will be, if the escalation continues in Ukraine, there will be further steps in the fields of sanction. Those sanctions are, seen from Russia, are either for the moment armless or a very slow poison, because what's happening is that in fact it's arming long-term investment in Russia. It's not arming today's system. The problem is that the political system in Moscow revolves around the Siloviki, the security people. And those are not very sensitive to economic sanctions or visa bans because they have They hold a very nationalistic view about how they want to behave. So they don't necessarily relate to these sanctions, but I think those sanctions are already having an impact on the Russian economy, even though the slowdown of the Russian economy started before the sanctions, and now Putin is blaming it on the sanctions. But I think at the moment what the West can do best is really work very seriously to make these elections happen, to monitor them with international observers, from OSCE, from the EU, from the Council of Europe, all these organizations that do that for a living in a way, and that should be there, and make sure that those elections take place properly, with a vast majority of the Ukrainian people giving a vote, and then we can move to hopefully to a more political process. And this is where the West can make a difference.
Let me bring Dmitry BABICH on this. Dmitry, your thoughts?
Well, there were just several things that I think were completely wrong here. For example, when Camille said that people from the right sector who were demonstrating on Maidan are not Nazis. I mean, it's enough to read the program of the Svoboda Party, formerly National Social Party of Ukraine.
And is the Russian economy?
I let everyone finish, and then now no one is letting me finish. So this party is a part of the governing coalition right now. The government is formed by this former National Social Party of Ukraine and Batkivshchina. And I think it explains why people in Odessa and people in the east of Ukraine are unhappy. You don't need Russia to make them feel unhappy when you have neo-Nazis in power, because Svoboda openly lionizes the Ukrainian nationalists who collaborated with Hitler and some of whom participated in the extermination of Jews. You can read tons of books about that. As for the election in Ukraine, you can send OSCE observers, but when two candidates from the East were physically beaten in Kiev, when they are prevented from speaking to the nation via television, it's not going to be a fair election. And when hundreds of people are killed in a country, it cannot have a real democratic election.
But Dmitry BABICH, your reaction on the West's position. Yes.
Well, right. I think that the West should start a dialogue, not only with Russia. I would say that Yanukovych suggested starting dialogue between Russia, Ukraine, and the West back in November. It was the EU who refused to have it then. All the tragic consequences we know, including Crimea, which would have never happened if Ukraine had a legitimate government. Right now, the West is refusing to talk to representatives of the protesters in the east of Ukraine, a new actor on the stage. I think sooner or later, the government in Kiev and the West will have to do it. They will have to talk to these people, because as we have seen from these pictures from Lugansk, these people are not all Russian agents. A lot of these protesters are civilians. There are millions of them. They may not want to join Russia, but they don't want to live under the government that is now ruling in Kiev. And now when they are forced to choose between Tymoshenko and Poroshenko, they are unhappy because neither Tymoshenko nor Poroshenko represent their interests. In Crimea, 88% of the people voted for Yanukovych, only to see him ousted in an illegitimate way, as Mr. KOSLOV rightly pointed out.
All right.
So in this situation, the West should start dialogue. Instead of expecting something from Putin, they should at least start talking to him. They have never really talked to him in the last 6 months.
And NIVAT, the measures that were spelled out in Geneva between the Russians, the Americans, the EU, and the Ukrainians, is that for you a guideline on which to go?
Well, to me, the most important is what is happening on the field. And we all saw what happened to the measures that were taken in Geneva. Nothing. It was completely lettre morte, as we say in French. It was absolutely not listened to. It's forgotten completely. And I think Russia is buying time with,
Till May 25th?
But the same is Europe doing. Europe is doing the same, is also buying time. I mean, Europe doesn't know what to do. Europe, the EU, have no common policy towards Ukraine. We have no real specialist on Ukraine. We are perplexed. we are like a boxer, you know, just we received a knockout and we don't know what to do regarding Ukraine. On the other hand, we have Putin who knows exactly what he's doing. Well, he knows what he's doing and he's doing it. So of course he's stronger than us. But to me, the most important is to see until where will it lead all us? Because I know this spiral of violence. It can take a while before we all sort of realize that there should be negotiations. So why? But there is a sort of a human incapacity to realize that before it has gone
before it gets
far.
Out of control. And NIVAT,
that's exactly when we are now.
I want to thank you. I want to thank Camille Grand, Anton, KOSLOV, Ina SHEVCHENKO. I want to thank Dmitry BABICH for being with us from Moscow, and thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.